So Helen, before we get started, are there any overriding considerations or factors that we should be taking into account as freelancers or contractors before we get to actually putting it down and concretising those terms?
So you need to understand what your services are and what your business is doing, maybe where the risks are so that you can work out what insurances you might need in place, where you might want any limitations of liability, to cover those sort of things. You should probably understand as well what the intellectual property position is. So do you own your own intellectual property? Will you be assigning that? Will you be licensing it? What will the customer or your client own at the end of it, and how that all works? If you do have intellectual property, is it yours? Do you own it? If you don't own it, do you need to sub-license it, and do you have the right licenses in place? Just making sure that all of that you know before you draw up the contract.
Sort of teeing everything up, isn't it, before you get started. The IP element is an interesting one as well, isn't it? Because for this type of arrangement, it's the company that's contracting with the client for the provision of the services, but you've also got an individual, the freelancer themselves, who's providing those services, and it's sort of picking up on the parallel requirements to have assignment documentation in place for the individual as well. That's really important too, isn't it?
Yeah, it's making sure that that individual is assigning it as well as the consultancy company, if it is the client that's going to have that intellectual property at the end of the contract.
Brilliant. So, I mean, we'll pick up where that crops up within this particular document, but you should expect to be creating a separate document, a separate assignment of intellectual property rights relating to the freelance services that the individual freelancer, not in the company's name, in the individual's name, will be signing. So the other element here, I suppose, that's really important too, is making very clear that this is a contract for services, so an arrangement that's provided at arm's length between two businesses and not a relationship that's much more of an employer and employee flavour. And there are some pretty exacting rules, especially the tax regime, that affects that type of relationship. They're governed very differently, aren't they? And we really need this particular contract to make very clear it's an arm's length arrangement.
Yeah, exactly. So the government introduced some tax rules which tried to look at tax avoidance around the use of consultancy companies or limited companies as the in-between between the actual individual offering the services and the end client. And it's just trying to look at whether that is an employment relationship or a freelance relationship.
And I guess the dangers of it being seen as an employment relationship is that the client business taking the freelance services suddenly finds itself in the position of an employer with all the things that come with employee rights, but you've also got the consultancy company then, needing to somehow figure out how it pays tax and national insurance contributions, I think, in a different way. So it's quite a complicated regime, but you just want to make sure that you're not falling into the trap of getting into employment relationships and staying very firmly in that sort of independent businesses doing project work or task-driven work together.